probably fix it. I think when you talk, like it'll go towards where it's coming.
That's okay.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you everybody and welcome to Meghan Zimmer's dissertation defense, as I'm sure this is what you were all here for. And for those of you online, thank you for joining in to cheer Meg on. I'm so excited for you all to be here and to see the incredibly hard work that Meg has put into her dissertation. She is just an absolute star, as I'm sure everybody here knows. She's just the most incredibly organized and committed and hardworking student, and it's amazing to see, and you'll see this through her dissertation, how she's designed her work to really be in service. To be in service of others, to be in service of trying to make diets better for young children. She's been continuing that theme in her position after this, where she's going to be going into government service at USDA. So she's very brave to be going into federal government. I'm very proud of that. So we're going to have Meg present her work and celebrate her work. Afterwards, there's going to be a little bit of questions from her committee. So the committee includes Dr. Christina Gago, Dr. Cindy Leung, and Dr. Teresa Fung, along with myself. And then we'll open it up to you all to ask some questions. And we will confer over whether she defended her dissertation, and then we will celebrate. So any questions, concerns, worries? All right, take it away, Meg.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining my dissertation defense. To those of you both in person, as well as to those of you that are online. Hi, I know you can't see me, but thank you for coming to my defense. That's titled Measuring WIC's Impact During COVID-19 and Beyond. To those that are on Zoom, if you have not already done so, please double check to make sure that both your camera and your microphone are muted, and that those stay off for the duration of the presentation. That's going to help us maintain bandwidth. Also, we will have limited capacity to answer questions live, so really encourage folks on Zoom to use the chat box. This is being recorded, and I will get like an export of the chat box, so if there's any questions that we don't get to, I'll be able to follow up with you directly offline afterwards. Or if you just write a nice note, I get to keep those too. Okay, so just kind of an outline for how this will work for anyone that hasn't attended a defense before. For the next, or roughly for the first hour, basically I talk and I present about the work that I've done over the past few years for my dissertation. And I'll move directly into some oral acknowledgements from there. The second hour, as much as I hope this first hour really feels like a lunch and learn, educational type of thing, the second hour is an exam, so my committee will be questioning me, and we'll have a limited number of time at the end for some audience questions too. The committee will then step outside to deliberate and cast a vote. And for anyone that happens to stick around all the way until the end, you'll get to be here for the decision announcement. So that's sort of a logistical outline for how today is going to flow. More of a conceptual outline for where we're going with this talk is I'm going to start off by providing some background information about what the WIC program is and what its key services are. And progressively, we're just going to keep narrowing our focus. So we'll zoom in to talk about how those services changed during the COVID-19 pandemic, and then narrow in a bit more to talk about a specific service, which is the WIC food benefits. Then narrow in even more and talk about just one slice of the food benefits, which is the cash value benefit for fruit and vegetables. And that's where we'll pick up paper 1, which is a cross-sectional evaluation of WIC participation status after the cash value benefit increase. We're then going to zoom all the way back out and talk about WIC services as a whole for the rest of the defense. I'll introduce a new measurement tool for measuring WIC's impact holistically, and then we'll apply that in the context of surveillance work. So that's where we're headed. But I've now said the word WIC a couple times, and I'm going to be talking about WIC for the next 2 hours. So it's really important that we all have a common understanding of what this program is and what it does. So like any good academic, I'm going to start with an acronym definition. WIC is the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children. And it's one of our federal nutrition assistance programs. As the name implies, it serves infants, toddlers, and children up to their 5th birthday, as well as people that are pregnant or postpartum. To be eligible for WIC, families have to live at or below 185% of the federal poverty level, or they might adjunctively qualify for participation in other needs-based programs, so long as they are at nutrition risk. Those that opt into participating receive a suite of benefits, one of which is the WIC food package. And I think that's often what many of us, at least in the nutrition department, think of first. When we think of WIC, we think of those food benefits. But it does also provide nutrition education, breastfeeding support, and referrals to social and medical services. Collectively, these comprise WIC's 4 key services. So whenever I refer to WIC's 4 key services, that's what I'm talking about. But like most things, WIC changed a lot during the 2020 pandemic, and specifically the Families First Coronavirus Response Act of 2020, which is that acronym up on the slide, implemented a series of waivers, which are sort of like short-term policy changes. I've listed some up on this slide, and it's okay if you can't read them specifically, because the point is actually just that there were a lot of them. But this is kind of an instance of like where one thing is not like the rest. So if we take the cash value benefit increase out of that box, everything else that is up here, all of these short-term policy changes are really focused on changing the way WIC is operating, both in the clinic as well as in the food retail space, but without changing the benefits themselves. That's why the cash value benefit change was so unique, is because it actually changed the amount of WIC benefits that someone was getting. What it did was it increased the dollar value for fruits and vegetables from $9 per month per child, which is what it was pre-pandemic, initially up to as high as $35 per month per child in several states. Massachusetts was one, and that went into effect in June 2021. And then it was standardized across the board for all states at the end of that fiscal year to $24 per child per month in October 2021. So if you're used to thinking about things using like epidemiology language, you can actually think of this as increasing the dose of WIC that participants are getting exposed to. What's also really interesting about this change is that it was codified as part of the 2024 WIC food package revisions. So this is one of those like temporary COVID era waivers that actually now is here to stay as part of our permanent nutrition policy, at least here in Massachusetts, as well as what we're going to focus on. So it's really important to know the impact that it's having, not just in the pandemic era, but also now that it's been made part of our permanent policy, which brings us to aim 1, the cross-sectional evaluation of WIC participation status in Massachusetts children's nutrition after the 2024 cash value benefit increase, which is under review at JAM. And so rather than me kind of rattling off like a jargony objective statement or repeating my specific aims over and over again, which my committee has heard a lot, I'm actually just going to throughout frame this as like a question and a hypothesis, because those are like first 2 steps of the scientific method, right? Like ask a question, form a hypothesis. So the question here is, what is the relationship between WIC participation status and dietary outcomes after the CVB increase was made permanent here in Massachusetts? We hypothesize that relative to children that are eligible for WIC, but not participating in the program, that the WIC participating children would have higher intakes and higher frequency for both fruits and vegetables. So if you think about those 4 key benefits we were talking about earlier, this is where we're really zooming in on just the food benefits and even more so just the fruit and vegetable piece of it. We'll zoom back out later. So I've given you just a touch of the policy background, but in terms of the scientific background, we actually know quite a bit about this topic already by just reading some of that pandemic era literature. So for example, we know that WIC participants were highly satisfied with this change. We also know that they had self-reported that it increased their purchasing and variety of fruits and vegetables. That online survey research was later corroborated with some benefit redemption data that showed that yes, the amount of fruits and vegetables that were being redeemed and the diversity of fruits and vegetables that money was being spent on both went up. There's also some data out of California that there might have been some spillover benefits to other nutrition relevant health outcomes. For example, longitudinal and equitable improvements in food insecurity by race and ethnicity. But what remains a little bit less clear is how exactly this all translated into the amount of fruits and vegetables that we're actually getting in kids' mouths. I know for anyone that's fed like a toddler or a young child, this is really hard to do, let alone to measure, but it is really important that we try to get a good understanding of that. So the first, for a while the only, and still to date, probably the best study on this topic came out of California. And they actually found that in their sample during this time period, fruit and vegetable intake went down by 0.03 cup equivalents per day. But when they rerun their analysis and they restricted it to just the kids that had the lowest intakes at baseline, it went up by 0.23 cup equivalents. So if that's surprising to anyone, this is surprising to a lot of people. This paper made a big splash when it first came out. And unfortunately, it was picked up by a couple bad policy actors that really zoned in on the fact that, like, oh no, fruit and vegetable intake went down. We shouldn't be giving out extra money. Let's cut these benefits. But I wanted to draw attention to the fact that even though this is a statistically significant finding, because the confidence interview does not include the null or zero, it's not a clinically relevant one. We're talking about effect size of 1 grade. But when we focus on the kids that had the lowest intakes at baseline and needed the most support, they went up by almost a quarter cup a day, which is like 6 grams. And so throughout this first day, I'm going to be talking a lot in cup equivalents, which might be really intuitive for our registered dietitians in the room or some of us nutrition scientists that just talk about cup equivalents all day, every day. But for anyone following along, I'm always going to try to convert this to grapes. Now, what we still don't know is how this all played out here in Massachusetts. And also there are a couple dietary outcomes that hadn't yet been reported in the literature. Things like the frequency with which fruits and vegetables were being consumed. And I was also curious about total diet quality, which possibly could have changed, for example, if kids were to eat more fruits and vegetables, and if those were to displace or substitute out other less healthy snack foods they might have otherwise been eating. And perhaps most importantly, from a methods standpoint, all of the studies that I had previously introduced you to had been done with exclusively with participants. And so they didn't have a comparison group to eligible non-participants, and we don't know what that difference actually looks like. So this first aim is going to address all 3 of those knowledge gaps, and it was set up as a cross-sectional post-intervention study design. We collected our own primary data here in Massachusetts. We collected 2 different types of dietary data. One is frequency-based data that we collected using a screener called the RPDQS Kids. And the other was meat intake data, which we used 24-hour recalls for, specifically using ASA 24. For both of these, they were parent-reported, so it's sort of a proxy intake by the parent or caregiver's report of the kid's diet. And everyone in the sample had a complete set of dietary assessments, meaning that they had both the screener and the recall in order to be in the sample. Additionally, we did invite participants to participate a second time, and as you can see from the numbers that are on this slide, many did, so we did opt into participating again. And for things like our 24-hour recall, that set us up to be able to take the average of the 2 groups. Now, I think since everyone here is pretty much in our nutrition department, you're probably really familiar with 24-hour recalls. That's like our bread and butter in nutrition survey research. But what you might not have heard of before is the RPDQS Kids, and that's because it did not exist before this study. So when we were looking for a measure to try to capture frequency of intake, we couldn't find one that had already been validated in this sort of unique sample of low-income children that were eligible for WIC. So what we did was we took the Rapid Prime Diet Quality Score for adults, or the RPQS, and we created an adapted version for kids. And as you sort of start to scan this top row, you can see that what parents are reporting is just the frequency with which a food is being consumed. You can use that data as is, and we definitely did, but you can also convert it to a diet quality score by using these traffic light scoring standards. So it gives us just kind of like a quick and dirty frequency-based diet quality score where any of the red boxes would be 0 points, the yellow boxes would be 1 point, and the green boxes would be 2 points. If you're curious about the reliability and validity of this tool, you can read more about it in our dissertation bonus paper, which is also under review at JAM. Shout out to Noor, who's the first author on this, because otherwise I wouldn't have been able to collect the rest of the data that I'm going to show you today. So a couple quick notes also on methods. So our outcomes that are under study here are obviously fruit and vegetable frequency, calculated as times per week from the RPQS Kids. Fruit and vegetable meat intake, calculated as cup equivalents from ASA 24. And then as an exploratory secondary outcome, diet quality score, which is always a point value, and that was on the RPDQS Kids Index and the HEI Index. Everyone in the sample was eligible for WIC, so our exposure or independent variable was just a binary indicator as to whether or not they were currently participating. And the data were analyzed using linear regression with inverse probability weights, or IPWs. These IPWs had child-level variables, age, sex, race, and ethnicity, parent-level variables like education and employment, and household-level variables like food security and snack participation. A quick note on these is in the WIC field as a whole, it's really challenging because a lot of our gold standard study designs we would want to use, like randomized controlled trials, are not available to us, right? Like it would be totally unethical for us to have taken a group of folks that are eligible for WIC and randomize them to either get or not get the government benefits that they are actually entitled to receive. And so as a field, we are always relying on these observational study designs. And when that happens, we know that there's a little bit of selection bias between the folks that are actually going to opt into WIC and those that are going to choose not to participate. So they're never going to be perfectly exchangeable. These IPWs are just sort of a fancy analytic technique that we can use to sort of reweight the sample based on other traits to try to make them a bit more exchangeable. They're also very useful when you have imbalanced samples. So according to our a priori power calculation, we needed at least 300 kids, 150 per group, in order to have 80% power to detect an effect size of 0.23 cup equivalents. So this was powered based on that clinically relevant part of the California study, that 6th grade estimate. We did fall a bit short of that, so in total we had 280 participants, and they were unevenly split between participating and non-participating. They did vary in the ways that we expected them to, and so we collected data on a lot of these things. So for example, we saw consistent with the literature that WIC participants had lower prevalence of employment and a higher prevalence of unemployment, despite looking for work. Interestingly, both groups had really high rates of food insecurity, and so we see that more than half of the kids in either group is living in a household that's experiencing at least some degree of food insecurity. So these are really high need groups. But despite the fact that need was sort of consistent across the board, we see that WIC participants were much more likely than non-participants to dually enroll in other programs like SNAP and Medicaid. So we see that WIC participants are in like the 70% range and non-participants are more in like the 30% range. So all to say, they differed in ways that we expected them to. We did collect data on as many of those as we could and adjust for it as best we could. So moving into results, the bar chart shows the crude or the unadjusted estimates. And the bullet points show our IPW models. So we found that WIC participants consume fruit 4 more times per week and vegetables 2.5 more times per week than their non-participating peers. Additionally, for fruit at least, this did translate to a meaningful change in intake, where we saw that WIC participants consumed 0.6 cup equivalents more fruit on a given day relative to their non-participating peers. But there wasn't a statistically significant difference in vegetable intake. I did just want to draw your attention briefly to the beta coefficient for fruit. So that's sort of like the effect size. Because 0.6 cup equivalents is a lot. Now we're talking about like more than half a cup a day on a given day. So something more like 16 grapes, give or take, depending on the size of the grape. So moving into the secondary exploratory outcome of diet quality. I know there's a lot of numbers on this slide, but I can sum it all up very quickly by just saying everything was null. It did not matter what diet quality index we used to score diet quality, whether that was our PDQS kids or HEI. It did not matter how we stratified the data by age. It did not matter the specific set of covariates that we included in the IPW, or even if we used an IPW at all. We also just ran it with standard traditional multivariable linear regression, adjusting the covariates the normal way. So we did a lot. There were a lot of sensitivity analyses here. And the main takeaway is that everything was consistently null. So as a whole committee, something we grappled with a lot was, is this a true null? Or are we perhaps just underpowered to detect a true underlying effect? And so all we know from these data are that that gap between WIC participants and non-participants is null after this policy change went into effect. But we don't know anything about what that looks like beforehand. We don't have pre-data. I spent a lot of time in the literature looking around, hoping that maybe another state had done something like this and had pandemic estimates. Also, NHANES has a pre-pandemic data file. We're hoping someone did something with that. They have not, but the NHANES data were available. So like any curious group of researchers, we couldn't help ourselves but to just download the NHANES data to build this ourselves. So now you're no longer looking at Massachusetts estimates, but you're looking at here are nationally representative estimates for toddlers on the left, children on the right. That green circle is going to represent a perfect diet quality score. And one of the first things you might notice from looking at this is that the blue line, which indicates WIC participants, and the red line, which are non-participants, are both really far from that green circle. Like they both have a lot of room for improvement. The most relevant to our research question is the fact that these blue and red lines crisscross each other a lot. There's a lot of overlap in them, which is just visually showing us what we also statistically and empirically confirmed, which is that there weren't any differences by WIC participation status in diet quality even before this policy change went into effect. So the null findings that we're seeing post-policy change in Massachusetts is at least consistent with what we were seeing nationwide before the policy change. So if you're curious about these pre-pandemic estimates, you can read more in our third dissertation bonus paper, which is out now in JAMA Pediatrics. So in conclusion, for this first game, we had hypothesized that non-participating children would, relative to WIC, score a bit lower, have lower frequency and intake of consumption for fruits and vegetables. And generally, we did see that. So at least for 3 of the 4 outcomes, we saw that WIC participants had better outcomes. The exception, of course, is mean vegetable intake. But I still think that this was kind of a positive finding overall, because even though we were underpowered, we were seeing statistically significant findings for our first 3 outcomes. And not only that, but we were seeing really clinically meaningful effect sizes, right? Like we were hoping to see something on the order of magnitude of 0.23 cup equivalents or 6 Greeks. But what we saw was something that was on the order of magnitude of like 0.6 cup equivalents for 16 grapes. So these were positive findings. Okay, this is here, so I remember to take drinks of water. Okay, so I think aim 1 is a really great example of how we can use our existing dietary assessment tools to measure tightly focused nutrition outcomes in the context of a very specific nutrition policy change. But I'm going to spend the rest of this dissertation arguing that we're not always that lucky, and we can, in some cases, should be measuring WIC's impact a bit more holistically. And so this is where we really move into the measurement piece of this dissertation. I'm going to take just a moment to contextualize measurement in the context of public health, because a PhD in public health nutrition is inherently very different from some of the other sciences. I know this firsthand for some of my college friends in the room that have been with me since freshman year. They know that I actually started off as a biophysicist. And the lab that I worked in studied particle acceleration in dark matter. And we can barely understand dark matter, let alone do anything to change it. But the whole point of understanding in public health nutrition is so that we can change it, specifically through interventions, programs, and policies. And so I had this mentor that was really motivated by this Maya Angelou that said, she kind of like had highlighted the last part that said, when you know better, do better. And so there is this knowledge to action pipeline that I think all of us accept is a core tenet of public health practice. But in terms of public health research, I think we can all appreciate that in order to know a thing, we first need to be able to measure that thing. And it's the field of measurement and psychometrics that really allows us to conceptualize and then measure some sort of thing. We call that thing an underlying latent construct. So in the context of this dissertation, whenever I'm talking about sort of an underlying construct, the construct I'm going to be talking about is WIC's impact on 4 domains of child health. So I'm going to take just a few more slides to set this up, because it'll set up both aims 2 and 3, and then we can pivot to looking at just methods and results and all the really fun, nerdy pieces of it at the same time. But I think in order to appreciate the second half of this, it can help to reflect on the history of the WIC program, because WIC's changed a lot over time. So WIC actually just started off as a food program. So it was only actually designed to provide a service, and that was this direct provision of food benefits in the form of the WIC food package, which actually used to be a physical package. Over time, though, it's evolved. And so in 1978, nutrition education and referrals to social and medical services were introduced, which brings us up to 3 key services. In more recent history, in 1992, a new food package was introduced for individuals that were exclusively breast or chest feeding. And then in 2004, the breastfeeding peer counseling program was established. And collectively, these 2 policy changes really established just like this ethos around breastfeeding promotion and support that we consider now to be the 4th and final key service that WIC provides. And so when we're talking about participation in WIC relative to non-participation, all of this is really wrapped up in our exposure variable. And you can actually think of the WIC program as being like a series of 4 simultaneous interventions on a kid, many of which tend to happen at the same time, close to their clinical. And so even though our exposure variable is all of this, we have never quantified this impact holistically, and we've never had a measurement tool to do so. In my opinion, there are a couple important consequences of this. One is probably that we're just underestimating WIC's total impact on kids when we're just studying outcomes in isolation and not really accounting for the synergies between some of these different domains. It also leaves us entirely unable to answer certain research questions. So what I'm going to show on this slide are a series of questions that are like real questions that I wrote down in my real physical lab notebook when I was trying to brainstorm ideas to bring to Erica's office to propose a dissertation. And so one set of questions that I had was just overall, was WIC's impact higher before or after the COVID-19 pandemic? So like given that really long list of waivers that I had showed you earlier, was that enough? Like, did we do better? Or was that just barely enough to kind of buffer against what we now know were these otherwise downward trends in diet quality that were happening during the pandemic times? Also, just generally, what are trends in WIC's impact over time? Was WIC more impactful in some historical time periods than others? And if so, what can we learn from that? And so just to give you sort of a heads up of where we're headed, initially I had proposed this first set of questions as my third aim and got it almost done, but we still don't have the post-pandemic FPEDs. So there's still a blank line in my code for that piece of it. That manuscript is half written, but we are not going to have an answer to these questions by the end of the defense today. However, by the end of the presentation, you will have an answer to the second set of questions about trends in WIC's impact over time. So that's where we're headed. But in order to do that, we need some sort of measure of WIC's impact. And so that brings us to aim 2, the development and validation of the NHANES WIC Impact Index, which is under review at Pediatrics. Okay. So the question here is the NHANES WIC Impact Index a reliable and valid tool for measuring WIC's impact on kids across 4 domains of child health? And the hypothesis generally is yes. There are specific a priori hypotheses for each specific reliability and validity test, which I will go through one by one as we go through them. But generally, for this aim as a whole, we're just trying to get at like a positive signal that like, yes, this is an okay tool. So this was set up as a cross-sectional evaluation of the index's psychometric performance, and we used NHANES data, which is again that nationally representative US surveillance data set. Just like all the other aims, we're focusing on WIC eligible children. And to analyze the data, we looked at 2 types of reliability and 4 types of validity. And I'll talk through each of those one by one in a few moments. But I first just wanted to introduce you to like what is even in this index. So just like the WIC program has 4 different services that it provides, this index is going to have 4 different domains, and each of those domains map onto one of those services. So the first that we think of usually is the food package, and those food benefits. That was what WIC was initially intended to do. And so we do have a dietary intake domain that corresponds specifically to the goals of the WIC program. So you might recognize that there's some variables up there that are tied to the cash value benefit for fruits and vegetables, variables that are anchored in the other parts of the WIC food package, which tend to be like ounce equivalents rather than a dollar value. And then 3 nutrients, because WIC specifically is targeting these 3 nutrients. For anyone that's a bit unfamiliar with some of the nuances of WIC, in order for a food to kind of make it into the package, so in order for like a specific variety of food to actually count as being eligible, it often has to meet minimum nutrient specifications for one of WIC's nutrients of focus. So for example, cereal has to meet minimum specifications for iron, tofu has to meet minimum specifications for calcium, and yogurt has to meet minimum specifications for vitamin D. That's why those are in there. WIC provides breastfeeding promotion and support. And so we do have a breastfeeding practices domain with both initiation and duration included in there. WIC also provides nutrition education. And so we do have a nutrition literacy domain that is using knowledge and use of MyPlate as sort of a proxy for nutrition literacy. The rationale here is that even though WIC's a federal program, it is administered at the state level. And so state to state, there is quite a bit of variability in how they set up their nutrition education curriculum, and also just clinic to clinic that tends to vary too in implementation. And so since this is supposed to be, an NHANES WIC impact index, right, we want it to be useful for surveillance. The least common denominator kind of across the board is MyPlate. So all of the WIC clinics are educating on MyPlate as it relates to the dietary guidelines. And so for that reason, wherever NHANES happens to send their mobile exam units, wherever they happen to be sampling on a given year, which should be educating on these things. That's why these are kind of the focus of this piece. And then 4th is WIC provides referrals to social and medical services. And so we do have a social medical service access domain. You'll notice that the first 2 variables are really focused on insurance because WIC refers out to Medicaid. There's also some variables for vaccination status because WIC helps parents keep track of their kids' childhood vaccination schedule and refer out as they're needed for additional vaccines. And then food security, because WIC does refer out to SNAP as well as other hunger and poverty alleviation programs that can help to address this. So that's what's in the index. I'll start to go through some of the results, and for the sake of time, I'm just going to present one type of reliability, and the type I'll be talking about is called internal consistency. So with internal consistency, we're asking, how consistently do items on the NHANES WIC Impact Index measure the same underlying latent construct? For anyone that took PHS 2000 with me, or maybe just took it in a different year, you might remember that this is typically measured using Cronbach's alpha, but Cronbach's alpha assumes a unidimensional underlying latent construct. And that's not what we have here, right? Like we explicitly have a multidimensional tool. And so our hypothesis is sort of the reverse. Like we are expecting to see a low Cronbach's alpha because we know that we've got a multidimensional index as a whole, but even our domains itself tend to have a lot of things tied up in it. So as expected, we did see relatively low Cronbach's alpha even within our domains. It hovered around the version of like 0.3. And so yes, we saw low internal consistency consistent with our expectations for a multidimensional index. Validity is a bit more clear cut, so we'll kind of pivot to that. And the first type of validity we always want to look at is just like content for face validity. So like, is this tool measuring what we think it's measuring and what we want it to measure? And so we asked, do the components of the index actually align with the goals of the WIC program? And the answer is yes, because of a mapping exercise that I'll show you on the next slide. But I did just also want to flag that this development process was happening in tandem with WIC stakeholders throughout. So we had a couple conversations with WIC colleagues and then fielded brief surveys to staff and researchers. So there was buy-in here too. And what we found is that each of the individual index items, or think of these as like the variables for the index, can be traced back to a specific example of WIC benefits. Sorry, my slides cut off in the screen share, but that says examples at the top. And each of those examples of benefits are anchored in a specific program or policy item. And so, yes, there was validity there. The next type of validity we'll take a look at is called criterion validity, so another C. This type of validity compares a tool to some sort of gold standard. There is no gold standard for us to compare to for the index as a whole because it's kind of the first in its category. But what we can do is break it up into its parts, and we can take each of the domains, compare those back to some sort of gold standard in that respective field. So for example, we can ask, to what extent do scores on the NHANES WIC Impact Index's dietary domain align with another measure of diet quality? For that, we use the Healthy Eating Index, and those HEI scores are on the y-axis, and the WIC Impact Index dietary domain is on the x-axis. You can see that the correlation coefficient was 0.58, which honestly is pretty strong in our field of nutrition. I took a psychometrics course at the ed school. They would classify this as more like moderately correlated. So it is a little bit discipline specific, but depending on how you interpret it, it is somewhere to moderately to strongly moderately correlated, which is what we would expect. But importantly, that it wasn't perfectly correlated. And this is because these two tools are measuring and defining diet quality a little different. That's kind of the whole point. If we could have just used the HEI for WIC questions, then we would have never had to do this. Moving on to one more C, we're now on our third C, which is construct validity. We set this up a couple different ways, but the one I'll show you here is just a test of known group differences, which is essentially a test where if we know that two different groups vary in some way that's relevant to our outcome, can our tool actually distinguish between those two groups? So we know from A1, as well as a whole body of literature, that WIC participants and non-participants do differ in ways that are relevant to this index. And so we asked, does this index sufficiently discriminate between WIC participants and non-participants? As we answer this question, I'll briefly just orient you to this table, which is that the 4-domain index is on the left, and then a modified 3-domain version of the index without nutrition literacy is shown on the right. If anyone's curious, I can get into some of the nuances why we had to do that later, but for the sake of following along the presentation, just know that like everything that we did, we actually did both ways for the 4-domain and the 3-domain. I'm just showing it here because here's where it becomes most relevant. Where those arrows are pointing are the current WIC participants score out of 100 on this index as a whole. And then we've got the adjusted mean differences for two different categories of non-participants relative to a reference category of WIC participants. And so as we try to answer this question, a couple of things you might notice are, first of all, that those beta, or those point estimates, are all negative, which is what we would expect, right? Like we would expect non-participants to be scoring lower on the index than our current WIC participants. Also, the ordering is as expected. So we would actually hypothesize that WIC participants would score best, followed by non-participants that never enroll, and then prior participants. There's some nuances there that's maybe not super intuitive. It's because of some selection bias concerns, and I can expand on that later, but that is our hypothesized ordering, and that is what we saw. But there are a couple important caveats. The first being that there's limited statistical significance. So you can see we are only actually detecting significance in the 3-domain index, which is why I put it up here. I don't think that actually has anything to do with the number of domains on the index. It's much more just related to the fact that this was a larger sample size. So we had more power to actually pick up some of those differences. And then clinical significance is a little bit murky. I can't just translate this into number of groups for you because we are now talking about points on an index. And so that's a little bit more convoluted, and I can try to expand on that and try to contextualize it more firmly or interpret it better. But just know as we go through these, we're now talking about points. So it's a little bit murky. Okay, we've moved forward one letter in the alphabet. We've made our way into these. Divergent validity. Honestly, you can just think of divergent validity as like a sanity check. We want to make sure that our tool is not spuriously correlated with something we're not trying to measure. And for me, it was really important that this index is actually sensitive and specific to the program, and that it wasn't just a broader measure of food insecurity or food access or participation in federal programs as a whole. So we asked, among WIC non-participants, is SNAP participation status associated with index score? And just to be very clear, the hypothesis here is no. We want null findings here because SNAP participation should not be predicted by this index if it is truly specific to WIC. And so as you start to scan this slide, you can see that across the board, we did have null findings. So it did not matter if we were talking about the 4 or the 3-domain version of the index. And it did not matter if we were talking about total score or domain score. They were very consistent. So in conclusion, there is evidence supportive of 2 types of reliability and 4 types of validity for this index. There's definitely some more work to do, and I can forecast future research directions towards the end of this talk, but at this stage, we at least felt confident trying to apply this tool to answer a surveillance question, which brings us to AIM-3. So AIM-3 applied the NHANES WIC Impact Index to a surveillance question related to trends in WIC's impact on US children from 2007 to 2018. This manuscript is submission ready, but it has not been submitted to a journal yet. We actually have not decided on a journal yet. So if anyone has any journal ideas, please talk to me after this device. And so the question here is, how has WIC's impact changed over time? And do these trends differ by WIC participation status or socioeconomic status? We were hypothesizing that non-participants would have a significant negative linear trend, while WIC participants had ideally a positive, or at least a stable trend. It was set up as a serial or like a repeated cross-sectional analysis using the 2007 to 2018 NHANES. Our outcomes were the total score as well as domain score on the index. Our exposure, or our independent variable, was time, which we were able to treat as a continuous variable by using the midpoint of each NHANES cycle. Sorry, I'm getting prompted to re-enter my password. Yay! Oh, whoa, everything I clicked when it was. Okay. Apparently my internet connection is unstable. Anyways, in terms of analyzing these data, essentially what we were doing was multivariable linear regression, because we're just testing for the presence of the linear trend over time. That's what we're doing here. So I'm going to show a couple quick figures, and what you can see in this first one is this is a figure for the total score for current WIC participants. And we can see that it just insignificantly bounces up and down over time. But when we layer in folks that are eligible for WIC but not participating, specifically a group of prior participants, we see that they actually had a significant negative linear trend. Same thing with diet, where we see there's sort of this like decline, but then 60-point rebound. And since we were just testing for the presence of a linear trend over time, it netted even and there was no significant trend here. But again, when we layer in those non-participants, we see this significant negative linear trend. However, there were not any significant trends in the breastfeeding domain or in the social and medical service access domain. Also, keep in mind that for all of these, we weren't seeing any significant trends in the WIC participant category. But when we pull out WIC participants that had the lowest income levels, so anyone that was below 100% of the federal poverty level, we did actually see a significant negative linear trend. And it was the same order of magnitude as the non-participants. So that's something we probably would have otherwise missed without some of these sensitivity analyses. So my advice to some of the earlier G years that are in the room is to do every single sensitivity analysis your committee recommends, because they do know what they're talking about. So in conclusion, we were expecting that non-participants would have this significant negative linear trend over time, while WIC participants would have either a positive or at least a stable trend. We didn't see any positive trends, but we did see sort of stable trends. And I just want to make the point that like this is why it's so important to have a comparison group, because someone could look at these data for just WIC participants and see that everything is null and say, oh, WIC isn't having an impact. Let's start cutting this program. But once you consider the fact that the non-participants actually have these significant negative linear trends, it actually changes our interpretation, because now our interpretation becomes that WIC might actually have this stabilizing influence that's protective against the otherwise negative trends that children would be experiencing if they did not have this benefit. So, like most research projects, we've addressed the question at hand. We haven't fully answered it, and I'm definitely left with more questions than answers. So there's a lot of areas next steps for some of this work. Of course, some next steps include continuing to explore the psychometric performance of the index itself. There's a lot of tests we could and eventually should do over time. Also, in the context of this whole dissertation, I've been talking about WIC-eligible children, but children aren't the only group that WIC serves. And so starting to think about how we can apply some of this to some of WIC's other population groups. Once we feel really confident in our tool, we can continue to explore some policy-relevant research questions, and some of the years that I've listed up here are years of really significant WIC policy. WIC research might recognize some of those numbers, like the 2009 WIC food package revisions. And as we peel back all of these layers of the onion, we can finally get to what I think are really like a lot of the core questions, which are, where are there disparities in WIC's impact on kids? And so how can we identify those so that we can target those kids for additional support? Starting to explore things like dose response, and by that I mean, what dose of WIC do kids need to get, or how long do they actually have to participate in the program before we can accumulate some sort of signal or response on our index. And then vice versa, if we take our index not as the outcome, but as the exposure, we can start to explore questions like, how many points on the index do you need to accumulate before you see downstream health outcomes changing in kids? So there's a lot more work to do, and I'm excited to continue some of it. So over the past 6.5 years, I have had a winding journey as a federal scientist through 3 different federal agencies in a mix of part-time and full-time, as well as civilian and even uniformed positions. And so it's been a journey, but I'm excited to return to where it all began. So I will be rejoining the USDA Food Surveys Research Group. They work with a lot of NHANES data, and I'm really excited to keep working with a lot of this NHANES data in my next steps. So the work will continue on, but the dissertation itself is ending. So here are my dissertation products. Thank you. So while I have the floor, I've been asked to move directly into my oral acknowledgements, and I have note cards. I not made myself any notes for the presentation, but this is the part I really didn't want to mess up. Okay. This dissertation is the product of many people whose guidance shaped the work, obviously, but also the person completing, me. At every stage, I have been supported by individuals who have grounded and regrounded me in the purpose of this work. I am profoundly grateful for the communities that have invested in me, and it is a privilege to acknowledge them here. Starting with my committee, Dr. Erica Kenny, my academic advisor, research assistantship supervisor, principal investigator, course professor, and DAC committee chair. These are all formal assigned roles. Mentor, however, is not a formal or assigned role, but I'm so proud to call you that. Your mentorship struck a remarkable balance between productivity and care. You are always available to talk through analyses, refine an introduction, summarize the latest hot take on breastfeeding scholarship, but also to share book recommendations, recommend the warmest winter socks, or laugh at something silly our cats did. You created a true open door environment, which fostered open-minded thinking, and it is precisely that openness that allowed me to think deeply and creatively about complex questions in our field, like how do we even measure and define success? Dr. Cindy Leung, your list of roles in my training is equally long and full of acronyms. PQE1, ACD. As these acronyms and the committees have evolved over time, so too did our working relationship. You met me where I was at each stage. First as a student during qualifying exams, then as a collaborator in the dissertation, and now as I start to approach graduation, you treat me more like a colleague. Those transition points have been key to my readiness as a professional. Each transition point has helped me grow. Thank you. Dr. Teresa Fun. You were randomly assigned to my PQE1 but you've remained part of my PhD journey by choice, and for that, I'm so grateful. Throughout, you never lost sight of the broader vision as I worked through the details. You consistently helped me step back and ask about what mattered most, like which results belonged in main versus supplemental tables, or how covariates shaped causal pathways. You helped me see both the forest and the trees. Thank you. Dr. Christina Gatto. Thank you for sharing your deep expertise in WIC and for the steady encouragement you offered throughout this process. You read every single word of every single draft with care and insight, even while on leave, which I think speaks volumes about your commitment to me and your commitment to this work. Your feedback has strengthened this work in countless ways. Thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge funding support for AIM 1 from Healthy Eating Research, as well as the NIH T32 for my own training and development. There are also a lot of people in the Department of Nutrition and Population Health Sciences PhD program who keep things running smoothly, especially Steph Dean, who is here in the room with us today, as well as from the PHS program office, Matthew Vicuzzi and Bruce Delano. Bruce is actually running the Zoom room today. Collectively, Steph, Matthew, and Bruce have been my go-to for any administrative problem, big or small, for which there were many over the past 4 years. To the members of Erica Kenny's research team, I'd especially like to acknowledge Noor Hamad, who has been there for me inside and outside of the classroom for so many things, including, but not limited to, when I got the phone call to adopt Archer, the day I went from Miss to Mrs., and today, where I'll hopefully go from Mrs. to Doctor. But to everyone that is pictured up on this slide, your companionship has really made this half the struggle that it would have otherwise been, but twice the joy. To my friends outside of school, believe it or not, I do actually have a few of those. Thank you for keeping me grounded and laughing. The dinners, spa days, audio messages, pickleball, squash, and tennis games have all helped keep me sane and make it to this day in one piece. Thank you for being my constant in a process that times felt like anything but. Thank you to my family. I'm going to turn towards the Zoom because they are on Zoom today. Especially thank you to my parents, who you can see in the middle row of this slide, for instilling the value of education in me. You can see just how excited I was for my first day of kindergarten in the top left. And thank you also to the rest of my family pictured on the bottom row of this slide. We certainly kept Nora busy every graduation season, but I am so grateful to have gone through school and life milestones together. and I truly just had the best time growing up with you. Finally, my husband, Javier, for being my biggest supporter. I first met Javier 7 years ago, and I knew right away the impact he would have on my life. But I am constantly surprised, in the best way, by the impact he has had on my career too. Javier, you've changed jobs, moved to new parts of the country, and taken on new responsibilities, all to support my career and my PhD, which you've always viewed as equally important as your own ambitions. Together, we've built tandem careers at the intersection of public health and public service, but also a rich and loving life as cat parents to Archer. I can't wait to see what we decide to do together next. Thank you, and I love you.
Love you more.
That's it. I'm the one presenting, so I'm probably feeling hot, but it is hot in this area.
I've no squirrel taking off her.
Okay, now that I've presented, this is gonna.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we can.